So in Pride and Prejudice, Miss Bingley is determined that she is going to marry Mr. Darcy. She's going to totally attract him, and one of her methods is by complimenting his library. We see throughout the book her complimenting the library at Pemberley and how she would be miserable in the future without an excellent library, and she just loves reading. But what is her angle here? Why does she keep going on about the Pemberley Library? And what does the Pemberley Library teach us about the Darcy family, financial status, social status, and Mr. Darcy's personality? If you want to learn all about that, then definitely stay tuned for today's video. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So the first mention we have of the Pemberley Library is actually in a scene at Netherfield. When Elizabeth is staying there taking care of Jane while she's ill, she feels like she has to go down in the evenings and hang out with everyone else for a while, otherwise it'll look like she's snubbing them. However, she decides while down there hanging out with them that she is going to read. Here's what the book says. Elizabeth walked towards a table where a few books were lying. Mr. Bingley immediately offered to fetch her others, all that his library afforded. And I wish my collection were larger for your benefit and my own credit, but I am an idle fellow. No, I have not many. I have more than I ever looked into. Elizabeth assured him that she could suit herself perfectly with those in the room. I am astonished, said Miss Bingley, that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, he replied. It has been the work of many generations. And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these. So here we learn multiple things about the Pemberley Library. One, that it is a very large collection because on one hand, Mr. Darcy is always buying books, and on the other hand, so have his ancestors. This has been the work of many generations. So first up, let's talk about Mr. Darcy always buying books. Here we see him acting like this is something he has to do, right? Like it would just not be living up to his duty if he wasn't out there constantly spending money on books, which is a total and complete wealth indicator because books were incredibly expensive in the Regency era. Even though they were cheaper than they had been in previous generations, the average person could not afford to go out and buy a bunch of books on a regular basis. So imagine that it's 1811 and you've decided to go book shopping. You've been reading the critical reviews of different books coming out, and you know what? You spot a latest release called Sense and Sensibility by a lady. You read the review. It sounds really good. You need to get it. How much is it going to cost you? About 15 shillings, which translated into today's money is about $70 US. Yeah, for a novel. Now, imagine you really love Sense and Sensibility. So a few years later, when Emma, by the author of Sense and Sensibility, comes out, you're like, I also need that one. And you go and pay the equivalent of $100 for it. Now, both Sense and Sensibility and Emma were published in a relatively small size, about 5 by 7 inches, similar to a lot of novels today. However, if you were Mr. Darcy and you were trying to stock up your library, not just with some great novels, but those really deep works of history and philosophy that need to take your library to the next level, how much are you paying for that? Well, great question. Before we get into that though, here is a word from our sponsor. So TYPOLOGY is a French skincare brand that likes to keep its ingredients to the essentials, the effortlessly chic essentials, and vegan and cruelty-free too. So first, I use their organic peppermint hydrolate to purify and prep my skin for my next step, which is using their tinted serum. I love using this instead of a heavy foundation because it really puts my skin first with ingredients like vitamin C, squalane, and aloe vera that help slow down photoaging, reverse dark spots, and hydrate my skin long term. But while it has long-term benefits, it also has short-term benefits of helping my skin look awesome. One of my favorite things about typology is that I don't feel like I'm just covering up today's imperfections, but I'm really giving my skin the active ingredients it needs to heal and look its best long-term. Then I use the tinted concealer under my eyes. It is packed with both caffeine and niacinamide, which helps reduce my dark circles both today, tomorrow, and over time. Then with a swipe of their lip oil in ruby red, it adds a splash of color to the look, and I add some to my cheeks too. Plus, it hydrates with vitamin E and jojoba oil. I had to look up how to say that. So if you want to check out Typology, then definitely use my special link. You can get a free organic peppermint hydrolate with your purchase of $40 or more on the Typology Paris website. This offer, though, is only good for the next week, so definitely click the link in the description below to shop their essential skincare today. For example, if you want to buy a book called The History of Persia, you would be paying £8, 8 shillings, which equates to about $840 for a book. Now, just to put that into some context, that $840 is probably very similar to what Mr. Darcy was paying new housemaids at Pemberley as their annual salary. Their wages were the equivalent of buying The History of Persia. Meanwhile, if we look at Mr. Darcy's spending overall on books, it could have been quite high. So for example, the owner of Audley End, which is another great country house in England, was spending on average £55 a year on books. Some years were higher than that, some were lower than that. One year was more like £100. Now, putting that in perspective, £55 a year would have been a good income for someone like a brick mason, a shoemaker, a lot of those sort of trades of the working class. They were hoping to earn in a year to support their families what these guys were casually spending on books. So basically, Mr. Darcy is out there flexing on everybody, spending an immense amount of money on books. And that £55 a year might be even low comparative to what Mr. Darcy might be spending. Because again, he thinks it's his duty to buy a bunch of books for his family library. So there's no telling how much he's spending. However, let us imagine again that we are buying that copy of Sense and Sensibility. We're in London, we buy it from a bookseller, they give it to us, we pay the $70. But then guess what we would notice very quickly? So if you buy a brand new book in the Regency era, more than likely it's not going to have a cover on it. So if you imagine walking through a Grand Country Estate library, all of the books have these beautiful leather covers that just make them look so grand and majestic. Well, those families had to pay extra for those because when you first get the book, it is sewn and often has boards, meaning that it has like these temporary covers on it made out of compressed waste paper into like a little sort of cardboard type thing. And yeah, it just has a temporary compressed paper cover on it. As a rare book librarian, David Falls explains, cheaper bindings would have paper covers or use cheap leather such as sheep. The brown leather binding we're familiar seeing on rare books is calf, while the most expensive bindings would use goat skin, commonly known as Morocco. Morocco has an attractive grain and takes color well. More expensive bindings could also be extravagantly decorated with gold tooling. So basically, you would get this book with its paper cover on it, and you would then take it to a binder. Now, this was also kind of a social flex moment because, of course, 5 different people from different financial brackets could hypothetically buy the same exact edition of Sense and Sensibility, but how much they could afford to spend on the binding of this book would result in far different results when they took it home and put it in their library. So, for example, we know Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility loves books. She loves reading poetry. Now, imagine she gets a little bit extra money. She's able to buy a poetry book Will she be able to get it expensively bound? More than likely not. She might be able to get it half bound, which is where they would put leather on the spine of the book in the little corners, basically where the board cover is most likely to wear down and break down, to protect it a little bit more. Or she might just take the book home in its board covers. Some people could not afford to bind their books, and then they were just like, I'm sticking with the paper cover. So for example, we see a lot of circulating libraries do this in the time period. And that is one of the reasons that Mr. Collins is able to identify the fact that a book that the Bennets have in their house is probably from a circulating library. So we all know that famous scene where Mr. Collins decides to read to his fair cousins. And you know what they offer him to read at first? Well, let's see. Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back and, begging pardon, protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation, he chose Fordyce's Sermons. So circulating libraries often had their novels still in their paper covers. So as soon as Mr. Collins sees this novel, he's like, that has not been rebound. Also, it looks kind of heavily used. I think it's a novel from a circulating library, and I shall not read it. Meanwhile, Fordyce's Sermons, which is just a house the Bennets happen to have lying about their house, has more than likely been rebound. Now, of course, as we saw in that quote earlier about how you can choose between calfskin and goatskin, and there's different colors and there's gold tooling, not all bindings, even once you were getting a book rebound, were created equal. You could get lower end materials, higher end materials, more workmanship or not. So for example, gold tooling is where you see those very intricate gold designs that have been sort of carved into a book's cover. That is gold tooling. So in the late Georgian era, there was a very famous binder called Roger Payne, and he did like the best work. He was innovative. He did beautiful gold tooling. Now, to do a beautiful, very intricate Bible cover, he cost above $360. But if you wanted a simpler, smaller book cover, then maybe it'd be running you somewhere about $90. Now, of course, if you didn't want to pay for the best materials and a bunch of gold tooling, you could get it for cheaper than that. However, is that really showing off your wealth? Is the book ready to be displayed on the shelves of Pemberley if there isn't some intricate gold tooling on it? I don't know. Now, let us imagine back to us and our copy of Sense and Sensibility. We have taken it to the binders, and pretty soon we realize that we're not just going to have one volume bound. We have to get all 3 volumes bound, because Jane Austen's novels, like a lot of novels in the time period and books in general, were put out in multiple thin volumes. So, Sense and Sensibility was originally 3 tiny little books, which also helps us understand something else that Miss Bingley is trying. So, have you ever wondered what this scene means when they're reading at Netherfield and the book says this? Darcy took up a book. Miss Bingley did the same. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book as in reading her own. And she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered her question and read on, at length quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his. She gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." So here we see Miss Bingley still attempting to attract Mr. Darcy. And since he's reading a book, she's going to read the second volume of his book, which does not mean the sequel, but rather books came in tiny little volumes. If he's reading chapters 1 through 10, she's reading chapters 11 through 20. However, what we also see here is Miss Bingley making her play for Mr. Darcy's attention. She's trying to engage him on a topic he's interested in. He cares about this book. She's asking him questions about the book. She's looking over his shoulder about the book, and he's just not really giving her anything. So when all of that fails, she falls back on general praise of excellent libraries and reading. She just loves them so much. She would be so unhappy. This gives us deep insight into Mr. Darcy. As she says, she has noticed that he is always buying books. She's been making a careful study of the things Mr. Darcy likes, and she has clearly identified that he loves reading, and he loves his library. And he loves Pemberley. And now she loves all of those things too. But what else does Mr. Darcy want in his life? Well, as we learned in a quote earlier, he does not want to neglect his family library in days such as these. But what does he mean by days such as these? What makes book buying so special in the Regency era? Why is it like the peak time to buy books? So in the Regency era, people had greater access to books than any generation previous. About the 1740s was when book production really took off. So basically, Mr. Darcy was like, there's books everywhere. I need to buy all of these different books. And we see him feel this sort of sense of duty towards his family library because it has been the work of generations, and he is not going to be the generation that lets everyone down. However, the fact that this library has been generations, many generations, in the building is also very noteworthy. So obviously many generations is an indefinite number. We don't know for how many generations back the Darcy family has been buying books. But if we assume many to mean at least 10, that would take us back to the 1480s. Now, back in the 1480s, the book market looked significantly different than it did in the 1810s. Basically, there were far fewer books, and they were harder to get, and they were rare, and they were expensive. And if you bought them, this is what it meant. Historian James Raven writes, in 1450, more Englishmen and women acquired and read books than ever before. Book owners included clerics, wealthy gentry, and tradesmen, but relatively few outside the confines of the court, monasteries, or great houses were personally familiar with a book. Some people treasured books as venerated objects, but such books did little to communicate information, news, learning, or religion to the great majority of the population. For many, books remained distant clerical accessories or trophies of social and political status. So basically, back in the late 1400s, buying books was a major status symbol. Most people in the country had zero access to books. If you had them, you were wealthy or you lived in a monastery. Those were your options. And this really lines up with something that Lady Catherine de Bourgh also says about the Darcy family when she is talking all about why her daughter, Anne, and Mr. Darcy are meant to be together. This is how she sums up their family backgrounds. They're complementary family backgrounds. They are descended on the maternal side from the same noble line, and on the father's from respectable, honorable, and ancient, though untitled, families. So here we see Mr. Darcy descending from a noble line on his mother's side, which is because his mother was the daughter of an earl, as I talk about in the video on why Lady Catherine is flexing on us. Meanwhile, on his father's side, he comes from a respectable, honorable, and ancient family, though without a title. I actually have a video on why Mr. Darcy doesn't have a title too. I have just videos on so many random topics now, guys. So here, when Lady Catherine is saying his family is ancient, she is saying that they've been wealthy since ancient times. basically. They have been in that social top 1% for a long, long time. Which completely lines up with the information we have about his library being generations of collecting. And so the Pemberley Library is incredibly valuable. Between the books he's buying, between all the books all of his ancestors have bought, it's a major status symbol, a major wealth symbol, a major family history symbol. And remember, this is one of the things that Miss Bingley is really attracted to in Mr. Darcy. She loves Mr. Darcy in part because of his social status and stability and the clout that he would bring to their relationship that would make her so much more legitimatized in the upper class. And his library is sort of the epitome of this. It both captures his current spending habits of being able to buy all of these books and his wealth, but also his family of generations of buying books that were expensive and even rarer back in the day, and yet he just has them all nicely collected in this room, and it just tells everyone just how honorable and respectable and ancient his family is. Of course, the really big question here is, would you marry Mr. Darcy for his library? I think it's very interesting that when Elizabeth tours Pemberley, she doesn't even comment on the library. Does Elizabeth even really appreciate it? Also, a special shout out to all of my channel members. Hi! There are so many of you. Thank you for being part of our awesome community. And as always, guys, keep being awesome because you're awesome. Bye!